Hey everybody, welcome back to Amar City. Today we'll be doing quite some fun stuff actually. I was really looking forward to recording this episode since very shortly before I scheduled to record this episode I checked out the workshop as normal and just checking out if there's been anything new and whatever I can add to the game as I do almost every day. But super rarely I just open the workshop and there is something that makes me so goddamn happy it's almost like it's my birthday, and that is kind of what happened very quickly before I opened the game to record this episode. I was checking out the workshop and there's a new mod by BloodyPenguin called tree snapping, and you might know this from the mod prop snapping, which I use a lot in this city so far, which allows me to basically snap all of these props to the roofs, like all of the air conditioners and all of the other stuff that I've been putting on roofs, like advertisements and stuff like that. But what the tree snapping obviously does is it allows you to snap trees onto roofs, which used to be restricted to just the ground, which means that we can now plant trees and bushes and anything in the foliage tab onto buildings. And the reason why I was so happy about this is that this is actually something that I've been waiting for a long time, and I know it sounds so stupid to say that I've been waiting for a mod to come out when, it depends on others actually making that mod and getting out there and actually creating something which I was just guessing might happen at some point in the future. But this was something that I was just looking forward so much that I was really hoping it was gonna happen someday, because I've always wanted to have these gardens on the roof in Amar City. There are so many ways in which, especially in a very dense city, you can make the city a bit greener on the roofs, but also make up for the bit of a lack of garden that you usually have, and at the same time just make the entire look of the city much nicer. And especially with all of the very grey concrete-ish buildings on Amar City with those pretty flat roofs, and some of the buildings even have roofs with barely any HVACs or anything on them. Actually being able to add some foliage, and by that being able to make some roof gardens, was something that I was really hoping could be happening someday. So that's basically what I'm doing at this point. That was the first thing I wanted to do when I hopped into the game, and the first thing that I did was kind of experiment with the pieces. What kind of pieces do we have to make these gardens, because there are still some kind of things that you have to work around. For instance, the textures are a pretty big issue. Decals don't work on buildings, so you can't actually put any grassy or path textures on these buildings, so you have to work with any planters that don't snap to the ground that you can actually raise up to buildings that can actually be connected to make these sort of garden parts. So that's also what I'm doing a lot here, using these different types of planters to try and get some patterns into these gardens on the roofs. Another issue was that very often these hitboxes of buildings aren't actually meant to make gardens on top of. I can't speak English at the moment. These hitboxes aren't actually meant to place gardens on top of, actually. So sometimes you'll have your props like snap in the air above a building, or not exactly where you want them to. So the Move It mod was super handy in that case to make sure that everything snaps to the buildings correctly and that all of these gardens are actually making sense and actually still look okay as you zoom into the greatest level of detail. So I'm super happy about the way that it's been working out so far, and the way that the different assets and mods that are on the workshop just keep exponentially opening up so many more possibilities. The more assets and mods pop up is something that I really love about this game. And yeah, I'm just making these gardens. There isn't too much to say about the gardens themselves. There was actually a cut in there kind of going back to some general gardening around the city, but most of the gardens revolved around having some terraces, some places where you can sit down, or some lounges, as well as a lot of planters to be able to actually get some foliage into these gardens. And I'm just generally quite happy with those things. There was also another change which I might note now that I am recording this video anyway, and it's been a few hours since it's been announced. City Skylines Mass Transit is going to be out, and I am actually absolutely hyped about this. I was somewhat skeptical about some of the earlier DLCs And to be very frank, I don't even have disasters at this point, since I don't really see too much of a point in getting that, especially for Amar City. But I'm actually really hyped about the cable cars that are gonna be coming in the new DLC, but the blimps and ferries are absolutely amazing as well. Ferries especially is something that I would have loved to see very much earlier as well, especially when I was working on the Dutch city. Didn't really imagine that it would get into a DLC at some point, but here we are anyway, and I'm actually just very happy with the way that the DLC is set up, in the sense that looks like it's going to be quite versatile, especially if you're a transit person like me and you're into that kind of stuff and you want to have as many options as you can have for your city. It opens up a much wider array of possibilities than, say, the very thematic DLCs of adding a snow map and some things related to that, which you don't really do anything with in my case, for instance, because I don't have any of the snow maps. I don't really use them. So all I get to benefit from that are trems, but I'm not sure if that's really worth the price. And with this DLC, I see that not being as much of a problem, for me at least, since it's much more widely applicable. Also, I am looking forward to the monorails, though I already had the question if I want to wait with the DLC and maybe apply monorails in Amar City and mess with that. I don't think that's gonna happen at any point, but I am very hyped about the DLC in general, and I would love to try, especially cable cars. I wanted to actually try a ski resort kind of city a long time ago. That never really came into anything, because obviously there's no way to actually build cable cars in the game right now, but that could very well change in the future. We'll see. I don't want to make any promises, but I'm just generally very happy about the stuff that's happening. So yeah, that's basically why I'm in a good mood. And other than that, oh yeah, something I also wanna mention is that much of this episode, before we go into the second half, which is doing the suburbs, and between the bits where I'm working on the rooftop gardens, because that stuff is still also kind of coming back throughout this episode, that between these bits I'm actually working on the general foliage of the city. And the reason is that I actually took some off-screen time, did a stream to work on the city, expand it a little bit and get some detailing in areas that were still very lackluster so far. So we should be pretty much good to go with the parts that we have, and all I still needed to do in this episode was just get into some of these areas that didn't have all the planters yet that I wanted to have, and make sure that all of the foliage is all nice and done throughout the city. So coming back to some of these roof gardens, this is kind of the struggle of making sure that these planters work. This was also the moment where I realized I had failed and I didn't have the square version of this planter, so I had to make the entire planter out of the diagonal parts, which wasn't too much fun, but it still works, I guess. Some of these planters can sort of be intersected to make different shapes, and I think that's where the biggest potential for making these rooftop gardens lie. Like, you don't want them to just become random spamming of like standalone planters with trees in them, but I really wanted to make like a garden that's surrounded by foliage and has these sort of rings and shapes of foliage rather than just individual trees and bushes. And I think that also kind of works with having the middle parts of these gardens being the areas where you actually chill out when you're on the gardens and have all of these, what are they called again? All of these trellises and stuff like that, and the chairs and lounges, so that you actually have a bit of shade from the foliage around it, and I guess that should just be handy. And here I'm coming to the building, which eventually ended up almost giving me frustrations about the fact that this is actually a stacked building, so I'm trying to stack scenery onto a building that is already placed onto a building, so the move it tool is really intensifying here. But it actually went fine in the end, I believe. Yeah, this was one of the buildings where everything was initially floating, so it took quite a bit of move its to make sure that everything is connected and pretty much on the ground. But that aside, just a simple garden, just that quick little wooden walkway, with some trees around them. And that should do for that part of the video. So now I wanted to get into making a new island, and I actually struggled with this quite a bit. I decided to just go into this with a general idea of what I wanted to go for, rather than to sketch it out on paper, which I've done with all the new islands so far. So yeah, that was kind of a bad decision because I ended up struggling quite a bit with getting the shape of this thing right. But anyway, in the end, I guess it kind of works. The tricky thing here is that this is very close to the airport. So I already wanted to kind of start laying out where the airport is going to be and where the runways are sort of going to overhang into the sea. And that sort of changed the making of the island shape and made it a little bit harder to actually make that work. But in the end, I think it's okay, at least for the time being. And it should provide a good space to do some experimentation in terms of what I'm gonna do with the rest of the city. Because quite frankly, I'm not gonna continue the exact same style, and I do want to make the rest of the city filled with some more family homes and some even detached and row houses to make sure that not the entire city is made out of these super blocks and high density mixed use areas, which are definitely good and important in a city. And this was also a pretty difficult reasoning for me to make, to actually decide to get into some smaller houses in the city. But I think it is important to also go into some lower density areas and make what are essentially going to be the replacements of the suburbs in this city. Because I don't think everybody can just live in high residential towers or in 5 to 6 floor high kind of super blocks in a European sense, and that if you have a family or you just want to care for a dog or something, you do want to live in a slightly more livable neighborhood. And I want to make sure that at least the city caters to the needs of every party inside it, which is also why there are all of these parks scattered throughout it, but also these playgrounds and all of these different types of buildings. And another reason that I'm kind of doing this instead of going for high density all the way is that in a sense it is actually more sustainable to go for some lower density than to cram in people in skyscrapers and make an entire high density city, especially if you take glass skyscrapers. But even the construction of concrete and steel is relatively unsustainable, and while it can easily be said that very widespread sort of sprawling suburbia in family homes is much more unsustainable, there is a sort of middle ground between that, in which you can actually cater to some more livable areas, I guess, while at the same time keeping it a bit more sustainable in slightly lower density than enormous skyscrapers. And especially as we go into, you know, the hundreds of meter tall skyscrapers, there is no way that that's the most sustainable option. And that's also one of the reasons why the skyscrapers in the city aren't exactly the most tall things. And I'm not going to go taller than the tallest skyscraper right now, which is 230 meters, but that's the tip of the antennas. So I think it's even lower than 200 meters. The buildings in the city are really not too tall. I've had quite a few complaints about this, but I'm not gonna change this at all, because I think it just works better for the idea of the city, which is that it likes to pretend, it's a bit pretentious, but it likes to pretend that this is trying to be a more sustainable city model for the Middle East than the way that, for instance, downtown Dubai is being developed now. And as such, I just kind of want to avoid getting into mega and super tall buildings. So yeah, that was basically my rationale behind all that. And also, I personally feel like it doesn't really fit the scale of the building, since the idea is that this is somewhere in the south of Bahrain and has maybe max 100,000 inhabitants. I think we can actually break that, but somewhere around that number, not too many. It's not an enormous city, and it's definitely not part of an existing metro region. So I don't think it should realistically have any buildings that have floors that go above 200 meters. So that's kind of my reasoning behind all that. Anyway, I'm getting behind massively. I want to catch up real quick. This is the area where I decided to make the row houses, and there's going to be plenty of detailing happening, so I guess I can still have plenty of time to talk about these things. And to get my inspiration for these, I kind of looked at two sources. One of them might be very obvious, and one of them might not be so obvious, though maybe obvious if you know me. Basically, I looked firstly at the suburbs of Dubai to kind of get a feel of what kind of buildings they would go for in the region. And while they are very sprawly and have grass and trees everywhere sometimes, they did give a pretty good idea of what kind of buildings I want to go for. Generally quite modern and very light textured. So that's sort of the selection that I made. But I also looked at suburbs in the Netherlands, because not just it's my home country, of course, and honestly, I think there is still a lot of Dutch bias in this series, and you can probably see that a lot of the things that I'm doing, I'm sort of probably doing from a part Dutch philosophy, which I probably also just can't get rid of. But I looked at some Dutch suburbs to get some sort of inspiration, and I think especially the way in which row houses and detached houses are intertwined and mixed together in some of the very newest residential neighborhoods in the Netherlands, in the Dutch suburbs, is something that I thought was very interesting and I should try over here as well. Hence the layouts which I have for the houses so far, and which I think works out quite well, so I'll probably be keeping that for some of the other outer suburbs for this city as well. But yeah, the layout so far is just based on those row houses on the outskirts, and then between that, sort of filling up the spaces, some detached houses. And both of these are still somewhat compact, and they're also kind of built around this sort of middle area between all the row houses, where there's just some trees or maybe some playgrounds, which you often see in the Netherlands. So that's maybe a bit eerily similar. But yeah, that's basically the layout. It's quite simple, but hopefully the charm will come through as the buildings, you know, that the asset creators have made are pretty good. And hopefully once we get all of the detail in, like all of the foliage and even some of these like backyard details that I would like to add, it should hopefully look a little bit more charming than just these empty desert things. So that's basically what I'm gonna go into right now. Adding some of these trees around here and making sure that we actually have some gardens fenced off, because these houses were just standalone houses and I wasn't really too happy with that. Though I'm not sure if these houses are actually standalone or if I just didn't get any of the workshop assets that you're supposed to get with them. But I can't imagine getting nothing with them. In any case, I had to make some backyards for these in a very Dutch style. Quite small, not even really large enough to grow a lawn in. But I hope in this kind of density it should be okay enough. And they're just pretty good areas to fill in with trees and make everything a little bit more green. Especially the date palms should be quite nice. I actually did a bit of research on foliage because I was really wondering what kind of foliage I should add to the city if I wanted to be sustainable, but also kind of work in the climate of the city. And what kind of surprised me, because date palms are super common in Bahrain and they even have a lot of date palm farms and it's a very important part of the culture of the country. What surprised me is that date palms actually do take a lot of water. I thought they barely took any water because they are so common in the deserts, but apparently there is an Arab saying that goes something along the lines of date palms are supposed to stand with their feet in the water and their head in the fire. And that's kind of like they have to grow in a very dry environment because they don't handle water well when they're in like the mating season. Trees, I'm bad at terminology, but when they're flowering, etc., they don't really handle a high amount of annual rainfall very well, which is ironic because they actually do need to take quite a bit of water. But also they work best in very sunny areas and very hot areas as well. So They basically work very well in the desert as long as you give them enough water, and I suppose that's also the reason why they are being often cultivated in these kinds of areas. Not to mention that they are actually quite useful and give some pretty nutritious dates, I guess. So that's quite good. But yeah, that's, for me, a pretty good reason to add quite a lot of date palms in the city, because as far as I see it, it's pretty good type of foliage to add some greenery to the city, in a sense that is good for the future, I guess, since it should be somewhat sustainable and it handles the climate quite well. But also something that is a bit of a link to the past, because date palms and date palm farms are very important, especially in the past of Bahrain. So that's something that even along these houses over here I have lined in almost every street. And I know I've been told by quite a few people that I am overdoing my date palms, but I'm sorry, I don't think I'm gonna get away from that anytime soon. I'll definitely try to mix some different types of foliage in there to not make it too repetitive, but I think these palms really do add a lot to the city. Which is also kind of why I have barely used any other palms actually. Now at this point, I'm just working on all of the decals of the paths, which I'm pretty sure at this point is actually what is lagging up the city. I know I haven't shown it in any of the videos, but I've got quite a few comments about this when live streaming. I run down to a very solid 7 to 8 frames per second while in the city. Whenever you're looking at like an actual part of the city. When I go to an empty part of the desert, it's more or less fine and jumps up to 40 FPS. But whenever I look at any part of the city, the frame rate tanks a lot, and it's really bad, and I believe that the decals actually play quite a large role in this. Foliage may very well play a role as well, but the decals are absolutely everywhere in the city, and I'm not sure how to fix the issue. As of now, I'm just kind of working around it and trying to work with the lag as much as I can, but it's a bit annoying, to say the least. I don't want to step away from the decals though, because the colorful ground for me, the colorful pavements, etc., is something that adds not just some character to the city, but also some very much needed color to it as well. Without this, it would have been a lot more grayish, and that's definitely something I didn't want. So here I'm finishing up the neighborhoods, which I just quickly made in this episode by adding some of the final details to it, all of the planters and all of the foliage, as well as the lights, and I'm trying to switch up the types of lights here and there. I noticed that especially in the first couple of episodes of this series, I've used a lot of the same lights all around the city, and I would like to actually change up those models a little bit, get some variety in there. But also I wanted to work on some more playgrounds, because that's something that I still want to get in here. No matter what kind of lifestyle you have or what kind of person you are, the city should be a pretty nice livable area, and so I'll cater to the children as well. That was actually a critique which I read today about Singapore, which is considered a super livable city and very high up there in many indexes ranking cities, but apparently there's a problem with the city not being very child friendly and being a very depressive place to grow up in, and I definitely don't want to get politics in here. I was actually extremely highly considering going to Singapore to study abroad, and I would love to go there sometime, but it's something that kind of did make me think that it's hard sometimes to keep in mind all of the different groups and all of the types of people that grow up in a city, and there's no way that you can control the community that grows up in a city. But still, I want to make sure that the city isn't just sustainable in the sense of nature, ecology, economy, traffic, everything, but of course also just in it being fun to live in. And with that sort of philosophical note, I would like to end this video because I'm running out of time-lapse to show you. So I would like to thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you guys sometime in the future when I'll be working on some of the new suburbs, or maybe some infrastructure stuff like the airports and the highway that'll be leading into the city. So see you later, guys.